Yeah, still going on the profile. So, the last thing we stated, well, we'll just kind of go back a little bit. We said that James Garfield won re-election to the House 8 times, and during his time in the Senate, he was actually voted guilty in the impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson. And after his election as president in 1880, he fought against both the stalwarts and the spoils system of government. It was kind of interesting because his vice president was a stalwart, so he actually was fighting against his beliefs of his own vice president. Okay, here's where we go. On July 2nd of 1881, President Garfield was scheduled to attend his 25th class reunion at Williams College. On July 2nd, 1881, President Garfield was scheduled to attend his 25th class reunion at Williams College. And if you're not old enough to know what those are, you'll have a 10-year class reunion in 2028, where all you'll get together and see who you married and how many kids you have and who's successful and who isn't. You kind of never take your spouses to those if they're not a graduate of your class, because you just get in trouble because some girl you used to go with talks to you and you get in a fight. Just to let you know. But anyway, he went to his 25th class reunion at Williams College, and he was walking through a reception room in a railway station. In other words, he was traveling by what? Train. And as he was walking through a reception room in a railway station, a stranger fired 2 pistol shots at him, crying out, quote, "I am a stalwart and Arthur is president now." True story. So on July 2nd, 1881, as President Garfield is traveling to his 25th class reunion at Williams College, he is walking through a reception room at a railway station. A stranger appears, fires 2 pistol shots at him, crying out, quote, "I am a stalwart and Arthur is president now." The shooter, a man by the name of Charles J. Guiteau, was immediately arrested and charged with trying to kill the president. Later will be charged with murder because the president is going to die. He does not die right away. So the shooter, Charles J. Guiteau, was immediately arrested at the shooting and charged with the attempted assassination of the president. The one bullet that Guiteau fired had merely grazed Garfield's arm. Didn't cause very much damage at all. But the other one lodged deep into his back. Okay? So one of the bullets fired by Charles Guiteau merely grazed President Garfield's arm. The other, however, lodged deep into his back. And the problem was the surgeons at that time in history, medicine was a lot different, could not locate the bullet. They had a heck of a time finding the bullet that was lodged deep in his back. And the bullet actually was lodged very near his spine, but he couldn't find it. And Garfield basically lay near death for 80 days with that bullet still lodged near his spine. They even brought in a famous inventor by the name of Alexander Graham Bell, who invented what, kiddos? Telephone. They even brought him in, and he unsuccessfully tried to locate the bullet with an electrical device that he had thought he could hear or see better. Okay? So they even brought in an inventor by the name of Alexander Graham Bell, who we know invented the telephone, who unsuccessfully tried to locate the bullet with an electrical device, which did not work. And historians will tell you that President Garfield remained fairly calm and pretty cheerful throughout that 80 days. But what caused his death, kids? Infection. Very good, Paris. Infection set in, the bullet stayed in there too long in a vital area, and infection set in. So they moved him to his seaside cottage in New Jersey, basically to try to make him as comfortable as they could until what? He died. So he remained calm and cheerful throughout his 80-day ordeal, but finally infection set in. They moved him to a seaside cottage in New Jersey, and he eventually died on September 19th, 1881. September 19th, 1881. Now, obviously, historians will tell you this, write it down if you wish, that if they had the X-ray machine and the modern antiseptics that they had today, no question he probably would have lived and survived that assassination attempt. But because of medicine of the day, they could not locate the bullet, infection set in, and the infection took his life. He was buried in Cleveland, Ohio. Well, after the president died, what was Charles Guiteau charged with then? The president's murder. He became an assassin. He was a shooter before. Once the president died, he was an assassin. And he also was a murderer. And he went to trial, and he acted like just a madman throughout the trial. And because he acted so weird during the trial, his attorney stated that his client should be innocent by reason of insanity. That was his defense. So Charles Guiteau just acted like a madman throughout the entire trial, and because of those actions, Guiteau's attorney stated his client should be innocent by reason of insanity. And the trial lasted 10 weeks. 10 weeks. So they have a trial, they present the evidence, they have the defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney, and then they take all the information, and what happens? Your jury goes to deliberation, and they come out with a verdict. So they listened to testimony for about 10 weeks, and the verdict only took about an hour to announce, which is a pretty short period of time, to be honest with you. So they went back and forth and had the trial, gave evidence, defense, prosecution for 10 weeks, and once the jury deliberated, it only took them about an hour to come up with a verdict, which was guilty. After the guilty verdict was given, Charles Guiteau was sentenced to hang, which he did in 1882. He was sentenced to hang, which he did in 1882. Who assumed the presidency for a short period of time? Chester A. Arthur. He became president after the death of Garfield. And kind of an interesting side note is, prior to his becoming president of the United States, his wife actually died in 1880. So he's the only one up to that point. That's not true. Well, it is kind of true. He was the only one that did not have a first lady during the presidency. James Buchanan, before Lincoln, did not have a wife, so his niece served as first lady in that official capacity. But Chester Arthur had no first lady during his presidency. So, here's President Garfield. He's got his agenda set as president, and Vice President Arthur took over. So what would you think Arthur's philosophy would be in finishing the term of James Garfield? What's he going to do with all the things that James Garfield started? Because he's a stalwart. What? What? Stop him, oppose him, all those types of things. He probably is going to go the opposite direction, right? Well, this is kind of an interesting fact. Because of the fact that Charles Guiteau yelled Arthur's name after shooting President Garfield, that bothered President Arthur the rest of his life. And as a result of that, he carried on the presidency as he believed President Garfield would have done. So he did not go his party line, so to speak. He felt so guilty and was affected so much about the assassin yelling his name as he shot the president that he carried on the presidency as if he was President Garfield himself. And he eliminated the spoils system of government, which infuriated who? Who was just, yeah, the stalwarts. And basically they branded Arthur a traitor, and his political career was history. So even though he was a stalwart, he was so bothered by the fact that Charles Guiteau yelled his name when he shot President Garfield that he carried on all of Garfield's policies and eventually eliminated the government spoils system, which infuriated stalwarts across the country who considered Arthur a traitor and his political career ended. Okay? All right, let's go to a new election. 1884. Election of 1884. Kind of an interesting side. These are all kind of interesting elections. Well, prior to the election of 1884, President Arthur, despite the fact that he had made enemies among the stalwarts, made it really clear that he wanted to run for the presidency. Made it real clear. He was going to try to run for his own election. Would it be re-election? No, because he assumed the presidency. So he's going to run for his own election, his own term in 1884. Well, despite this, the stalwarts were so angry they would not support his nomination. And instead, the Republican Party nominated James G. Blaine, who we've talked about, for the presidency. So even though Arthur wanted to run, he was stopped short, so to speak, because he couldn't get the support of the stalwarts. Remember, the Republican Party was split between the stalwarts and the half-breeds, and all those Republicans that considered themselves stalwarts because of what he had done, as far as the spoils system of government, didn't support him. So they nominated James G. Blaine instead. The interesting thing about this is that Arthur didn't know at the time that he wanted to run for election that he had a fatal kidney condition. So he had a fatal kidney condition at the time he was wanting to run for president. The point being is if he would have won the nomination and eventually won the presidency, he probably would have, well, he wouldn't have probably died in 1886 at the age of 56, and he wouldn't have lived to serve his own term as president if he would have been elected. But he didn't know that at the time. So ironically, President Arthur eventually died of that fatal kidney condition. He died in 1886 at the age of 56. And fact is, if he would have been elected president anyway, he would not have lived to serve his own term. Well, what happens when a party's split? You think all the Republicans are thrilled with James G. Blaine? They are not. You go back to the election, not all members of the Republican Party are happy with the choice of James G. Blaine. Many Republicans accuse Blaine of using his political influence and securing big favors for him because he had businesses and making profits. So he wasn't very popular. So what do you think the Republicans that didn't like Blaine did? What'd they do? What sometimes happens, we talked about before. They started a new party. Okay? And they called themselves, it really wasn't a party, they just split off and formed a group called the Mugwumps. The Mugwumps. You like these names, Mugwumps. So these people that were upset about Blaine's nomination, who pushed Blaine's nomination? Stalwarts. So who are upset about that? Half-breeds. And they formed their own political group known as the Mugwumps. Now, they didn't nominate a candidate for president, which seems a little unusual, right? But what happens with those votes that would come from the half-breeds? Would they go to Blaine, or would they cross over and vote for the Democratic candidate? That's what they would do. We'll get to that. Well, the Democratic Party nominated Grover Cleveland for president, who was a former governor of New York. And obviously, as we talked about, the Mugwumps threatened the stalwarts. Again, the Mugwumps are also kind of the half-breeds, right? They threatened the stalwarts that they're going to cast their vote for who? Who are they going to cast their vote for? Grover Cleveland. Well, despite all this fighting among the Republican Party, the election was fairly close, which was kind of a surprise. And historians believe that really Blaine could have won, despite this thing that happened on election eve. So a lot of historians believe that James G. Blaine actually could have won this election even, but something happened on election eve, that would be the night before people went to the polls, that changed the course of the election. Well, see how religion pops in here. A very well-known supporter of presidential candidate James G. Blaine referred to the Democratic Party, that would be the opposite party, as Romanism, and rebellion. Romanism, and rebellion. A very high-ranking supporter of James G. Blaine, who is the Republican candidate, states publicly that he believes the Democratic Party stands for Romanism, and rebellion. Who did that anger? Who got mad about that? Romanism. Catholics. So that offended the Roman Catholics, and because of that, all the Roman Catholics in the country that were Republican voted for who? Who did they vote for? Cleveland. Okay? That was a horrible mistake. So on election eve, a well-known supporter of Republican candidate James G. Blaine referred to the Democratic Party as Romanism, and rebellion. This statement angered many Republican Roman Catholics who then voted Democrat in the election. Did it make a difference? Let me tell you how close it was. Cleveland wins 219 electoral votes, Blaine 182. 219 to 182. Pretty close election. And historians will tell you that the Roman Catholic vote in this election probably made the difference. Now, what's the significance of Democrat Grover Cleveland winning the presidency? What's the significance of that?
Democrats haven't won in a long time.
Very good. 28 years, Emily. Very good. It was the first presidential victory for the Democratic Party in 28 years. Let's divide that by 4. How many terms is that? 7. 7 presidential elections since we had a Democrat. This is the first Democratic win in a presidential election in 28 years. You know who the last Democrat to win was? We talked about him. James Buchanan, before Lincoln. Republican, well, this guy replaced him, but Republican, Democrat. Okay? So last Democrat to win the White House prior to that was James Buchanan in 1856. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is important legislation passed under the presidency of Grover Cleveland. He actually got something done. These other guys, not enough to significantly mention. But Grover Cleveland got some things done during his presidency. 3 things in particular. Anybody want to guess what problems we've had, mainly concerning these elections, and maybe he might have tried to get straightened out? Anybody have any idea? What might have Grover Cleveland looked at in these past few elections and said, man, we better fix that? He can't really control anger, but there's a couple things that happen that we might not be too clear on. Just think about it. What might he think about? What have we had that's been kind of unusual in these last few elections? What was the first unusual thing we had? Didn't happen any election since or before since.
Someone won the election without winning.
Yeah, so remember they made the deal, right? Okay, he thought that's kind of odd. We shouldn't be picking presidents by making deals between parties. So one of the acts that were passed during the presidency of Grover Cleveland was the Electoral Count Act of 1887. The Electoral Count Act of 1887. What was the problem with that election of 1876? What caused the problem? Remember? What caused the deal to be made? Why didn't it just go smooth? What's that? Well, why was it off? You're right. 4 states sent in 2 sets of returns, and they had to do it all over. So what the Electoral Count Act of 1887 stated, that if a state sent in more than 1 set of returns, the set of returns that was approved by the governor of that state would be the official ones. So if somebody sends in 2 sets of returns, the governor is going to look at those 2 sets of returns, and he's going to pick the one that's going to count. And that would that be a little bit partisan? If it was a Republican governor, he might pick the Republican result. If it was a Democratic governor, he might pick the Democratic result, but maybe the Democrats won anyway. But the rule was, if any state sent in 2 sets of returns, the set of returns that was approved by the governor of that state would be the set that would be used to count, to represent that state. What was another issue that might come about that happened after a presidential election? We had our first what in a long time? Assassination. So we knew what would happen if the president was assassinated, right? What happens? But what happens if something happens to the vice president before the term's out? Well, we didn't know. And that was the next piece of legislation. It was the Presidential Succession Act of 1886. Actually, I got them backwards, but I'm going by your guesses, right? So the Presidential Succession Act was first of 1886. Now, it's not exactly the same as it is now. This is what it stated, that if both the president and the vice president died or became disabled, the cabinet members would succeed to the presidency in the order in which their offices were created.